The threshold is where? A serious look at how a wealthy nation views and measures the extent of poverty within its borders. Poverty in the United States should be viewed as a lack of capability and thus an inability to function within society. In order to fully measure poverty, a combination of absolute and relative quantitative methods must be used. Additionally, a complete understanding of the qualitative aspects of poverty that cannot be measured needs to be incorporated. Capabilities can be defined as the freedoms and opportunities created by the ability to choose and act. Basically, capabilities are the freedoms to choose. Nussbaum considered that there are 10 basic thresholds a person has to meet in order to live a dignified human life. They are as follows: life, bodily health, bodily integrity, sense, imagination, and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, political and material control over one's environment. While resources are not the sole determining factor as to whether a person is able to meet the capability threshold, they oftentimes play a role. Resources can be considered anything from money to the basic infrastructure needed. The lack of these resources can limit a person's ability to reach a particular threshold. For example, if a person cannot afford food, they are then unable to meet the need for life and bodily health. Functionings represent the fulfillment of a capability. If a capability is the ability to achieve, the functioning is the resulting achievement. Functioning is not required, but the ability to function, if so desired, is necessary. For example, a family going hungry because they are unable to buy food and a Muslim fasting for Ramadan both are not achieving the functioning of eating. However, their difference lies in the capabilities. The Muslim has the capability to feed himself, but is choosing not to, based on religious tradition. On the other hand, the family lacks the capability to feed themselves, and for this reason, they are not fulfilling their functioning. Quantitative measures measure the amount of resources a person has, regardless of the quality, in determining whether or not they are impoverished. The official poverty measure is an absolute measure of poverty that was formulated by Molly Orshansky in the early 1960s. This is an income-based threshold measure of poverty that is based on the cost of groceries. The cost to feed a family, the most basic and cheapest meal plan, is calculated and multiplied by 3 in order to form a threshold. If a family's total income is below this threshold, the family is considered impoverished. The income of a family is calculated by totaling all cash income of family members over the age of 15. This includes a paycheck before taxes, Social Security, and unemployment benefits, but does not include any in-kind assistance, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or temporary assistance for needy families. Although the OPM can be useful in recognizing widespread poverty and seemingly quantifying it, the measurement itself has several issues. Primarily, the OPM itself is outdated. It does not account for the rising standard of living since the 1960s, nor does it account for the fact that the average family now spends around 1/6 of its income on food, not 1/3. This affects the credibility of the numbers produced by the OPM. Additionally, the income calculation of the OPM is oversimplified. It does not consider the income taken in through government assistance programs, as well as the varying costs that can require larger portions of incomes, such as the shifting cost of living in different areas of the country and the cost of medical bills. The supplemental poverty measure is a quasi-relative measure of poverty. Like the OPM, it functions based off of an income-based threshold. Unlike the OPM, this threshold is calculated based on the typical expenditures of the general population in 4 categories: food, clothing, shelter, and utilities. These expenditures are calculated and the poverty threshold becomes the 33rd percentile of those expenditures. Those having an income less than the 33rd percentile are considered impoverished. The SPM calculated income consists of cash income, in-kind assistance, and transfers, while also taking into account other factors such as taxes, geographical location, medical expenses, and the cost of transportation and necessary childcare. Although the SPM offers a more holistic solution to measuring poverty, there are still several issues in its approach. The SPM could potentially overestimate the number of people in poverty due to its inclusive nature. Additionally, the SPM can be considered too generous, focusing more on comfort than necessity. However, it still does not account for social exclusion and other capabilities that cannot be measured materially. A relative measure of poverty is based on comparative economic deprivation. This means that the poverty line is formed by comparing an individual's economic and social capabilities to that of the rest of their society. With this measure, a person who is meeting their most basic needs, yet still falling far behind from the rest of their society, is considered impoverished. Relative measures take into account the fact that genuine needs increase in wealthier countries. For example, an American who lacks a cell phone is severely disadvantaged within their society. However, this is not the case for those in the poorest countries. The lack of a cell phone would not allow for the individual to fully meet their capability of affiliation with others, leaving them relatively impoverished. A person must be compared to those around him in order to establish the capabilities needed to properly function within his society. Additionally, social capabilities, beyond just basic needs, must be assessed in order to establish these capabilities. However, relative measures do have disadvantages. These measures are not useful in government allocation programs. Additionally, in an extremely wealthy society, relative measures can give a skewed view on poverty within a society by not always giving an accurate measure of what poverty truly is because it is only comparative. Qualitative measures do not take into account the amount of resources, but rather their quality. Not all aspects of the human experience can be understood through numbers and thresholds. The issue of human poverty is just as complex as the issue of human life. The ability for a person to think freely or be creative cannot be measured in figures, and a person's capability to form meaningful human relationships cannot be shown on a graph. Are those without these basic capabilities poor, even if they cannot be demonstrated through a mathematical equation? The quasi-relative takes the best from both absolute and relative approaches. Not only does it take into account the basic threshold of a person's need, but it also accounts for those in comparison to society in order to fulfill the capability of affiliation. Absolute measures set the foundation for the threshold. However, relative measures still fill the gap needed to account for a person's ability to participate in society and live a life with full dignity. Additionally, it is recognized that there are some aspects of poverty that cannot be measured with numbers, like the ability to creatively express oneself. A qualitative aspect to the quasi-relative measure assures that the full extent of poverty is accounted for. A practical combination of these methods is required to correctly diagnose all levels of poverty within the United States.